supply chains are complicated and multi-tiered, and mine is no different to many that that you're working in. The difference with me when I'm starting to look at my carbon and my impacts coming from agriculture, etc., is I'm quite distant from my farmers. So I go through traders who then go to farmers on the grain side, and you can see on the animal protein side, I've got my processors, collectors, the abattoirs, farmers, and then you've got the feed. So it's very complex. And I think one of the things we've all been wrestling with COVID is lots of supply issues. One of the advantages of COVID is as these supply chains got very empty and very stretched, it's actually brought us a bit more transparency so we can really see where the interactions are coming from and where everything is coming from. If we then look and say, okay, so how do we start to go about it in that supply chain? For us, this started back in 2015. We've got our Sustainable Intergeneration Plan, and we started off with a tiered approach. So addressing all categories and some basic elements in terms of supply. And as you can see, then we started to target what are our top categories where we see the most risk. And from 2015, we've been starting to map our supply chains going tier 2, tier 3, and even up to tier 4 to understand origin, where it's coming from, and then the sort of risk. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we're using the EcoVadis tool, but you're looking at what are the human rights exposures, what are the real sustainability elements, is there something around ethics we need to be aware of, and also, at the end of the day, what's the livelihood or the impact on the farmers. So this is something that we've been building up over the last years, and I'll be quite honest, it's not easy. It's a journey, and are we there 100%? No, we're not. So how do we go about doing it? Well, the first start point is, like I heard on the previous thing, this is about talking to your suppliers and collaborating with the suppliers. This isn't just a conversation, it's how do you get the information. And I started off a little bit tongue-in-cheek by saying that the first thing you need to do is know and trust the volume that you buy. I can see many of you are probably smiling already. You've got your data in your various ERP systems. Do you really trust it in terms of that's the volume, that's the origin, etc.? And we've done a lot of work to build that confidence. And now we do trust that information coming from there. Then the next bit became more complicated for us because I'm talking to tier 2, tier 3, and maybe asking them to talk to tier 4 suppliers, starting to map out where do these materials come from. At times we've used geo mapping to identify where the sites are, and then we look at the specific regions. But really, it is very much about conversation, engaging your suppliers. Now, at times, they may not be aware of the risks in that supply chain. At times, they may not be brands like we are, so they don't have the same motivation to go forward. 1 second. What that allows us to do is then you can move from what we've been doing in the past, which is an average intensity factor. I know this material is coming from Europe, and in Europe, the average intensity factor for Europe is X. Once you know origin, you can get into that country, or even better, into the sub-region, and say in that sub-region, the intensity factor is something different. And once you've got that, you can get your volume, your intensity factor. That's how we've started to build up a very accurate footprint in terms of what is our start position. So, okay, so once you've got that, what do you do? I've just chosen 5 very simple topics here. One of our pledges is to remove deforestation from our supply chain. Once we know origin, we can take that choice and we choose not to source in those regions. The next one is around regenerative agriculture, where if we know that from that region, the average farming practices are below the standard, we can talk to our suppliers and we can co-invest in a project to try and drive up farming practices in that region. It can also allow the sourcing teams to identify, instead of buying whatever it might be from Poland, it's actually a lower carbon footprint to buy it from Spain. So it's informing those sourcing choices. And then also it's about talking to the suppliers. Many of our suppliers have the same commitments as we have. So let's just tap into it and see how we can help each other to get them to that point. And then the final element, which is maybe not so much for us as sourcing, but it's a role that we play within the business, is when you work with the R&D guys, if they understand the impact of the materials that they're trying to put into formulations, and understanding that by taking these different products and maybe a different spec from a different region, you can reduce your overall carbon footprint. That's how we've been doing it, looking at, what is our volume? What are the the impacts on the region or sub-region, and then starting to play with these levers here. So overall, very quickly, it is a journey. It's not easy. And I'm absolutely convinced that where we are today will change because technology will give us more tools to find more. It's essential to have the dialogue with the suppliers. It really is about collaboration. It's not just sending data. It's about how do you go and do something about it. And then once you've got those intensity factors at the sub-regional level, that's when you get the real unlock. And that's where we as commercial can go and play and do the stuff that we do really well in terms of sourcing choices. I think that was just over 5 minutes. So I'll finish there and hand on to back to the room.
Yeah, very well done, Paul. That was pretty good, wasn't it? It actually worked quite well. Will we get through the others without them being on mute? That's the question. I reckon we can do it. Claire, up next. Claire Jones, the Group Procurement Director of Mace.
Hi, thanks for that. Can you hear me okay?
You're looking a bit...
Yeah, that's me. Can you hear me and see me okay? I guess
I see you fine, yeah.
Perfect. So I'm the Group Procurement Director at Mace, and what I wanted to do was talk about our journey so far and why net zero carbon is so important to Mace. So here we go, look at that. So our key business objective is to pursue a sustainable, to redefine the boundaries of ambition. And one of our key targets in our strategy is to pursue a sustainable world, which we can see on here. And we've just put a couple of targets we've got on there with regard to our target of carbon reduction programme in our 2026 strategy. Oh, it's working perfectly. So our priority themes for the 2026 strategy, and some of you will have seen the Steps Without Footprints that we launched back in January 2020. As Paul has said, in the construction centre, we have got a very deep and diverse supply chain. So we actually looked at the carbon both broken down into embodied and operational carbon. So you can see on the screens in front of you, we use a lot of the embodied carbon and we use in operational carbon as well. So on the embodied carbon, we were looking at alternative materials, buying materials locally, looking at alternative fuel sites and looking at alternative methods. And from the opposite side, we actually looked at what software we could use and low carbon mutes on our sites. I just thought I'd put the next screen on because you can actually see just how much of an impact our sector has on the actual global CO2 emissions. You'll read the quotation by David Attenborough on the left-hand side, but as a construction sector, we are a considerable provider into the CO2 space, which is not good. Also, going on to this next slide is very, very important to our clients that we are looking at our carbon and our carbon footprints. We've got a number of key clients that we work with, particularly in London, British Land, GPE and Grosvenor, and they've got significant targets on the right-hand side of net zero carbon developments, some of them commencing after 2020, and with a commitment in from Grosvenor, all buildings will be net zero carbon operationally by 2030. So we need to be supporting that sector significantly to achieve those. The next slide details our 2030 targets from Mace. We will eliminate the use of diesel on all of our construction sites. We will reduce absolute emissions by 60%. We'll reduce business travel by 50%, which clearly that's helped during the pandemic, and we'll reduce the embodied carbon emissions by a further 50% as well. To allow us to capture this data, we use a system called Optimise. So what we do at every project level, any CO2 emissions, any waste, any water, any packaging, any timber, any materials is all loaded into a software design that we produced ourselves, and that outputs our emissions and our on a monthly basis, so we can actually report back to the government on the outputs that we have. This just details what we've done in offsetting over the past 4 years, from borehole rehabilitation to clean cooking to rainforest and tree transplanting. This slide details the journey so far, and we started our commitment back in 2012, and we committed then throughout until 2019 when our Mace Tech division was developed and designed, and that's focusing on off-site production to ensure that we're not producing carbon on-site. The challenge that we set in 2017 was diesel-free, so that has been quite a challenge for us, and we are using hydrogen and HVO generators on a number of our projects across the UK. This is the supply chain journey so far, and obviously, as we've said, it's engaging and collaborating with our supply chain to bring us on the journey. So as we know, we as supply chain community have got a target to have all of our tier 1 subcontractors to have a net zero target strategy by 2026. We've broken that into the 3 scopes, scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. With the sector that we work in, scope 3 is going to be challenging because if you've got a structural steel line, you can't get to net zero with the production line by 2026. So those targets will stretch out to 2050, which is the government's requirements. This slide just details where we've got to with our supply chain. So we've set the target of 2026 to have 100% of our supply chain to be net zero, and each of them have to have submitted our strategy by 2022. We've got a target for 100% of our tier 1s, as I said, by 2026. And this must include all scopes with the exception of scope 3. And on the graph on the right-hand side, you can actually see where we've got to as of Q2 this year, and we're up to 45%, which is a significant movement in the right direction. The final slide on here just talks about how we engage with our supply chain. So we have our own business school. So we brought our suppliers on the journey with us. We've done some education sessions on how to write a strategy, what things to look out for, how to measure your carbon footprint, and simple things you could do around travel and offsetting to get to your targets quicker. So hopefully that's a quick whistle-top from Mace, and I'll hand over now to Lucy.
Brilliant, thank you, Claire. Excellent. And yes, Lucy. Are you there, Lucy?
I'm here. Thank you so much,
I'm in a
Claire
seance
and
or
Ollie.
something. Yeah, here we go. There you are.
I'm feeling the pressure now. Not only has the content been amazing, but they've got their timings and the IT sorted. So here we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Roche's Scope 3 journey, more from a perspective as to how procurement has been enabled to lead this and really to affect change within the entire organisation, particularly because transparency is super important in the information that we're collecting from suppliers. But the biggest pressure on us is what do we do with that once we've got it? So a little bit of background around Roche sustainability. So 3 core objectives in environmental, society and economy. Our focus on environmental is to reduce our environmental emissions or environmental impact by half by 2025. For us in procurement, this means driving a change in how we buy what we buy and how we partner with our suppliers to reduce environmental impact within our value chain. It's quite a big challenge, not least because Scope 1 and Scope 2 has been so expertly managed and measured over the course of Roche's existence. So I think we've had really impressive reductions, about 90% since 1995, on course to be absolute zero by 2050. So no reliance on offsets and true carbon removal. There's also been in place data collection for a really long amount of time and a systematic approach to how we are looking at reductions across the business. However, Scope 3, like many of our organisations, is the big elephant in the room. So 95% of our total environmental impact in our emissions. We have 125 companies that represent about 2/3 of this amongst 60,000 suppliers. It's at least 18 times greater than Scope 1 and Scope 2 combined. And to do something about this requires cooperation, alignment and investment from Roche and our suppliers. So we're setting the goal on how to measure this, but it's just part of the journey. To achieve it, we really need Roche and our suppliers to change behaviours, mindset and our investment decisions. So as a procurement organisation, we have identified some main drivers to achieve this. So the first is around baselining what Scope 3 really means. We started this journey a couple of years ago now, looking at spend-based emissions, mapping spend to DEFRA emission factors. Wholly inaccurate, but a fantastic start. So what this did for us was to provide transparency as an organisation, so that each business area, each procurement manager could have a look and see where our impacts are coming from. We are now evolving this year as we move towards the SBTI, and we're looking at activity-based. So we're moving away from spend-based, we're looking at quantities to try and get a bit more granularity, particularly in relation to our industry. The next key enabler for us is process and tools. So it's kind of sharing a lot of information amongst the business and with our suppliers, we found isn't wholly useful. What we need to be able to do is enable them to identify and assess alternatives and make change. So an example of this is looking at our products and doing scenario analysis, so understanding what's the impact if we change this material for this material. And that's something that we have to look at right at the R&D phase and communicate that throughout the whole value chain down through our suppliers. The third piece, which is something I probably underestimated, but is comms and change management. So how do we embed a mindset that nudges Roche and supplier behaviours? This is particularly challenging at Roche, somewhere that is passionately decentralised, so no mandating culture, and something where we're trying to all achieve these ambitions, but in a persuasive manner rather than dictatorial. So we spent a lot of efforts educating on Scope 3, educating on carbon emissions, what it means, and trying to incorporate this into everyday business language and decision making. The third piece, and I'll talk a bit more about this, is organisation, plan and governance. So how do we prioritise, align decisions and channel resources? And for this, we've had to ensure that we've got key stakeholders right at the top, engaged and supporting the messaging beyond procurement and affecting procurement strategy, CSR strategy, and throughout the whole business. And the final piece is metrics and incentives. So metrics and incentives that are visible and accepted to Roche and across industry. An example is joining Science Based Target Initiative and having the same expectation of our suppliers. And for the first time this year, we incorporated Scope 3 as part of our what's called our Blue Multiplier, so everyone's annual performance bonus for non-financial indicators. And we're looking to firm this up as we have targets so that everybody understands that everything that they do as part of our jobs is impacted when we decrease our Scope 3 emissions. So I think this may be my final slide.
Brilliant. There we go.
Sorry, final slide here. So key levers for success. So governance and leadership I've spoken about. So procurement very much leading, target setting and action, collaborating across all functions and reviewing end-to-end products and supply chain strategy. We have an internal supply chain sustainability council, so this allows cross-contamination of innovation and prioritising focus and funding to really drive down emissions. We have a carbon dashboard based on activity-based modelling, which allows for scenario modelling and driving sustainable decision-making. We've got supply chain financing programs, so having the available funds to make the changes we need to make. Supply collaboration has been mentioned multiple times, and I can only agree, super important. We are collecting data through Manufacture 2030. We're also partnering with a number of other suppliers, Deloitte being an example, where we're looking at innovative ways that we can reduce emissions. And we launched a supplier renewable electricity initiative as well. And finally, really key to have an external network. So working as part of the PSCI, Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, part of the Sustainable Markets Initiative, and continually benchmarking what our peers and across industry are doing to make sure we're in line and pushing the bar as far as we can.